In 1994, a former White House official made a shocking confession. His name was John Ehrlichman, advisor to President Richard Nixon, and what he said would rewrite the history of America. In an interview, Ehrlichman admitted the war on drugs was a lie. It was never really about drugs at all. It was about destroying two specific groups of Americans. To understand why, we have to go back to 1968. America was being torn apart by the Vietnam War. Protests filled the streets of Washington, New York, and Berkeley. Young Americans were demanding an end to the war. At the same time, the civil rights movement was gaining power. Black Americans were organizing, demanding equality and justice. Richard Nixon saw both movements as threats to his power. He needed a way to fight them without appearing overtly racist. So his team designed a strategy that would look legal. They would declare a war on drugs. But here's the part they kept secret for decades. The real targets were never the drugs themselves. They were the people who used them. In 1994, journalist Dan Baum interviewed Ehrlichman for a book. What Ehrlichman told him was beyond shocking. He said the Nixon campaign had two enemies in 1968, the anti-war left and black people. Ehrlichman's exact words were carefully chosen but brutally honest. He said, quote, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal. We couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." That was the full confession. When the interview was published, the revelation sent shockwaves. But by then, Richard Nixon had been dead for months. Ehrlichman himself would die just 5 years later. And the war on drugs they created never stopped. In fact, it only grew bigger. By 1980, America had roughly 500,000 people in prison. Today, that number is over 2 million. The United States holds more prisoners than any nation on earth. And black Americans are still the primary targets. Despite making up just 13% of the population, black people account for nearly 40% of those incarcerated. The disparity in drug sentencing tells the same story. Crack cocaine, associated with black communities, carried harsh mandatory minimums. Powder cocaine, used more by white Americans, carried lighter sentences. The law made possession of 5 grams of crack equal to 500 grams of powder cocaine. That's a 1-to-100 ratio. It wasn't based on science or harm. It was based on politics and racial targeting. Throughout the 1980s, President Reagan doubled down. He launched Just Say No campaigns targeting school children. Meanwhile, funding for treatment and education was slashed. Money flooded instead into policing and prisons. The prison industry became a massive business. Private corporations began running facilities for profit. They lobbied for tougher laws to keep beds filled. Judges were given mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. They could no longer consider individual circumstances. A young man caught with a small amount of drugs could receive the same sentence as a violent criminal. First-time offenders were given decades behind bars. Families were torn apart. Entire communities lost a generation of young men. And the cycle kept repeating. Children grew up without fathers. They faced poverty, trauma, and limited opportunities. Many eventually ended up in the same system. The statistics are staggering. 1 in 3 black men will go to prison in their lifetime. For white men, that number is 1 in 17. This isn't an accident. It's the design Ehrlichman confessed to. And it worked exactly as intended. The movements Nixon feared were systematically weakened. Leaders were imprisoned or forced into hiding. Voting rights were stripped through felony disenfranchisement laws. In many states, felons cannot vote even after release. Millions of Americans have been permanently silenced. But the story doesn't end there. In recent years, the truth has been spreading. Documentaries, books, and journalists have exposed the facts. The Ehrlichman quote has been shared millions of times. Public opinion on drug policy is finally shifting. Several states have decriminalized marijuana possession. Some cities have stopped prosecuting low-level drug offenses. Rehabilitation programs are being expanded instead of incarceration. Portugal decriminalized all drugs and saw overdoses drop by 75%. Other countries are following their model. The evidence is clear. Treatment works better than punishment. Compassion is more effective than cruelty. But changing a system 50 years in the making takes time. Private prison corporations still lobby against reform. Tough-on-crime politicians still campaign on fear. And millions remain locked in cages. But now we know the truth. The war on drugs was never a war on drugs. It was a war on people, on specific communities that threatened political power. And it was designed that way from the very beginning. John Ehrlichman's confession confirmed what many already suspected. But hearing it in his own words made it undeniable. He admitted they couldn't legally target their enemies. So they invented a proxy. They weaponized the law itself. And it worked beyond their wildest expectations. The prison population exploded from 500,000 to over 2 million. The United States now imprisons more people than any authoritarian regime. More than China, Russia, or any dictatorship in history. And Black Americans bore the heaviest burden. The neighborhoods Ehrlichman targeted never recovered. The leaders he wanted arrested were removed from power. The political movements he feared were fractured and weakened. His strategy accomplished exactly what he intended, but it came at an incomprehensible human cost. Millions of lives destroyed, families torn apart, communities devastated for generations. All to maintain political control, all to silence dissent. All because Nixon and his advisors saw certain Americans as threats. Not as citizens, not as equals, but as enemies to be destroyed. And they used the power of law enforcement to do it. The DEA was founded in 1973, 2 years after Nixon's declaration. Its budget has grown from $75 million to over $3 billion. Thousands of local police departments received military equipment. SWAT teams conducted no-knock raids on private homes, often at wrong addresses, terrifying innocent families. People were killed in their own homes during these raids, all in the name of a war Nixon admitted was based on lies. The Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search were eroded. Asset forfeiture laws allowed police to seize property without conviction. Departments became financially dependent on drug war seizures, creating perverse incentives to target communities with assets. The war also expanded globally. The CIA funded foreign militaries in the name of drug interdiction. Many of these militaries committed human rights atrocities. Plan Colombia alone cost over $10 billion. Yet cocaine production actually increased during the intervention. Every metric showed the war was failing. Drug use rates remained steady or increased. Overdose deaths climbed year after year. Drug cartels became wealthier and more powerful. Border violence escalated to war zone levels. Yet the policy never changed. Because it was never about solving a drug problem. It was about controlling populations that threatened the status quo. Nixon is gone. Ehrlichman is gone. But the machine they built keeps running. 2 million people still wake up in cages every morning. Families still visit loved ones through plexiglass windows. Children still grow up without parents. Communities still struggle under the weight of mass incarceration. But there's a growing movement demanding change. Activists are organizing in every state. Lawyers are challenging unjust sentences in court. Formerly incarcerated people are sharing their stories. And those stories are changing minds. More Americans now support drug decriminalization than ever before. Marijuana legalization has spread to over 20 states. Psilocybin therapy is being legalized for medical use. Safe injection sites are saving lives in major cities. The conversation is finally shifting from punishment to health, from criminalization to compassion, from fear to understanding. But there's still enormous resistance from those who profit. Private prison companies spend millions lobbying against reform. Police unions fight against decriminalization. Politicians still use tough-on-crime rhetoric to win elections. The system has become too big, too profitable to dismantle easily. But history shows that even the most entrenched systems can fall. Slavery seemed permanent until it wasn't. Jim Crow seemed immovable until it fell. The Berlin Wall seemed eternal until it crumbled. Change is possible when people demand it. When the truth becomes impossible to ignore. When enough voices say, enough. That moment is coming. Because John Ehrlichman's confession changed everything. It confirmed what couldn't be denied anymore. The war on drugs was a racist policy from its inception, designed deliberately to harm specific communities, to silence political opposition, to maintain white political power. And it succeeded for 50 years. 50 years of devastation. 50 years of families destroyed. 50 years of communities broken. But now we know. And knowing the truth is the first step to justice. The question is, what do we do now? Do we continue a system built on lies? Or do we build something based on truth? On compassion instead of cruelty? On healing instead of punishment? On justice instead of revenge? The truth about the war on drugs is finally out. What we do with that truth will define us. Will we be the generation that finally ends this war? Or will we pass this injustice to another generation? The choice is ours. But we can't choose wisely without knowing the truth. And the truth is clear. Nixon and his advisors weaponized the law against their enemies. They disguised racism as drug policy. They destroyed millions of lives for political gain. And they admitted it on tape. That tape changed history. It proved what activists had been saying for decades. What communities had been living for generations. The war on drugs was never about protecting people. It was about controlling them. And that control came at an unbearable human cost. But it also created something its architects didn't expect. A movement of people who refused to forget, who refused to accept injustice, who refused to let this history be buried. Because they know that silence enables oppression, that forgetting ensures repetition, that the only way forward is through truth. Nixon's war on drugs may have succeeded for 50 years, but truth has a longer timeline. And once revealed, it cannot be hidden again. The confession is recorded. The evidence is documented. The truth is permanent, and it demands a response. Not someday, not eventually, but now. While 2 million people remain imprisoned, while families remain separated, while communities remain devastated, while the machine keeps running. This is Nixon's legacy. This is Ehrlichman's confession. This is America's choice. Between the truth and the lie. Between justice and oppression. Between healing and destruction. The truth is out. The choice is ours. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments.